an adaptation is any aspect of an organism's characteristics, behaviour, shape, anatomy, physiology that enables them to survive better in their environment. So one behavioural adaptation that we've been looking at is one that you see every day if you go down to a local park, and if it's a park with a pond, you'll see ducks there, and you'll see that they're resting with their beak tucked into their feathers. So when they're sleeping, they have it there. We've been interested in, well, why are they doing that, and looking to see whether they're doing that to keep warm. And what we did was went out into the field and took hours and hours of videotape of shorebirds in different temperatures. And they found that they use, when shorebirds are resting, they use this beak tucking behaviour much more when it's cold, and when it's hot, they don't use it when they're sleeping. And so that's pretty good evidence that that behaviour is an adaptation to temperature. As it gets colder, they need to tuck their beaks in to keep warm. So one key element of structure is again related to bird beaks, and what we find is that because birds lose heat through their beaks, that individuals that live in colder climates tend to have smaller beaks than individuals that live in hot climates. And that makes sense because they're losing heat through their beak. If it's getting cold, you want to reduce the size of your beak to help reduce the amount of heat you're losing from the body. So, quite a while ago, I did research on metabolic rate in mammals. So this is the amount of oxygen, if you like, that is consumed by an animal per unit time. And what you generally find is that larger animals obviously consume more oxygen than smaller animals, but it doesn't, what we call, scale isometrically. In other words, it doesn't mean that a big animal is just a sort of blown up version of a small animal. What you actually find is big animals use relatively less oxygen per unit body mass than small animals. And there's been big debates about what the nature of that relationship in terms of how big animals use relatively less oxygen. And what I've found is that the way you interpret that relationship varies enormously according to what you understand as the evolutionary relationships between the animals. So if you think that such and such a species is more closely related to, if you think that gorillas are more closely related to chimpanzees than they are to humans, for example, then that changes the way you interpret how their metabolism has evolved. So Allen's rule was a principle described about 140 years ago by an American naturalist called Joel Allen, who used it to describe the general pattern that animals that live in colder environments tend to have shorter extremities. So that could be ears, tails, legs, beaks, whatever, anything that's sort of extreme to the body. And he argued that the reason was that it's an adaptation to the climate, so that you have smaller extremities in colder climates to help prevent heat loss from those extremities. It helps reduce your body surface area, and so you don't lose as much heat. So I think there are some extraordinary adaptations which almost defy explanation as to how they could have evolved, but and one of the interesting things is trying to work out how they did evolve. I think one of the most amazing one is parasite life cycles. So there's a type of liver fluke that is found in the liver of cows, but to reproduce it produces eggs which then go out through in the cowpats, and then a snail comes along and feeds off the cowpat, and the eggs turn into little larvae inside the snail, and the snail excretes them through its slime, and then an ant comes along and eats the slime, and the larvae go into the ant and head towards the brain of the ant, and they take over control of the ant and turn it into a zombie. And they make the ant leave its nest, and the ant instead goes and wanders up to the top of a blade of grass, waiting for a cow to come along and eat the ant on top of the grass as it's eating the grass, and then the larvae get back into the cow and head to the liver and turn into adult parasites inside the liver of the cows. That's 3 hosts of the parasite that it needs as part of its life cycle. Trying to understand how that evolved is extraordinary. So I'm interested in applying Allen's rule to understanding how animals might be responding to climate change. So particularly thinking about changes in body shape, because Allen's rule is to do with evolution of the extremities. And so the theory would be that as it's getting warmer, we should start seeing selection for larger extremity size. And so we wanted to look at this with our bird beaks. And I've had students going into museum collections and measuring historical specimens of birds. And we've been showing that, in fact, with things like Australian parrots, there's been about a 5 to 10% increase in beak size over the last century in those species, which would certainly seem to fit with what's been happening to our climate over the same time. I think the great thing about my research, in terms of why it interests me, is this opportunity to just try and explain why the world is the way it is, even if it's reasonably small things like why do ducks put their beaks inside their plumage when they're resting. It's the idea of being able to observe the natural world, come up with a hypothesis that might explain something, and then go out and test it and see whether that's the case. I think that's the coolest things possible, to make some contribution to understanding why organisms and the biological world is the way it is. I think that's the most exciting part of doing scientific research.